Welcome back to Women Making Moves, where we celebrate the moves that women are making. My name is Amy Pons, founder of Unlock the Magic, coaching, marketing, and healing. I'm joined today with Heliana Ramirez. Heliana, PhD, LISW, is a clinical social worker and researcher specializing in racial and anti-LGBTQ workplace trauma. Her expertise includes employee self-defense, post-traumatic growth, workforce wellness, and culturally responsive suicide prevention. Her work addresses the impacts of racism, anti-LGBTQ bias, sexism, classism, stigma, and institutional betrayal on the physical and mental health of civilian workforces and military service members. Heliana, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here, Amy.
Something that really resonates with me from your bio is, interestingly, in my corporate life, as we were heading into lockdown for COVID, and I was the head of the Women's Employee Resource Group, we were getting a lot of information from our internal investigation team that cases of domestic violence were spiking very soon after lockdown. And so what we did was we worked together with that team and with our gym to create a virtual Krav Maga course in self-defense for employees over the pandemic. And we would have it during the workday, so that way there wouldn't be any alarm bells or anything like that many women took advantage of over the pandemic, which I'm really proud of.
It's incredible. Oh my gosh, Amy. Amazing.
Thank you. And I took it myself. It was awesome. And just to hand back just a touch more something, and something you and I were talking about before we hit record is this is such a time, regardless of where you are, reclamation by any degree, reclamation of your own peace, power, magic, brilliance, self-reliance is something that I really vibe with right now. So anyway, that just struck me as part of your bio. I was like, oh, we have that in common.
I'm just amazed that you would do that and how I get shivers thinking about the impact for women who were able to participate. Many years ago, started out before I became a licensed social worker, I worked in a domestic violence sexual assault agency and I worked a crisis line. Mm-hmm. And so when you talk about using that workplace as an opportunity to create communal holding and radical transformation that women could then use at home to keep themselves safer is so brilliant. And, people talk about like psychological safety at work. And what you did there is that next level. That's like generative, transformative, increasing how the workplace can impact the life outside of the workplace in really liberatory ways. That's amazing. I feel like too often we're talking about the other side of the spectrum where the workplace stress and trauma is causing illness. But what you were doing there through that ERG, the Employee Resource Group, is creating liberation. That's amazing.
Thank you so much, Heliana. Of course, you and I met through our work with advocating for healthy workplaces and Workplace Psychological Safety Act. And, something that you've helped me realize, you and the whole team through WPSA, EWA, is that before I even knew fully that I had been receiving workplace psychological abuse, the bulk of my professional career, I realized I was doing these like small things. I was radicalizing myself, meaning whether it was through that self-defense course or we as an ERG again reconfigured all of the pad and tampon machines worldwide to be free instead of that SLA quarter. Things like that. Just like from day to day, how can we help every individual show up in their unique brilliance? They just want to show up and do their work and not feel the impact of the outside world, where it's almost impossible these days not to bring that with you. Anyway, so I was like slowly radicalizing myself while I was in corporate until it got to a fever pitch where I was like, oh, I outgrew this place. Got it. Yeah. I'm meant to be out in the wild.
Yeah. I love it. Dr. Resmaa Menakem, who wrote My Grandmother's Hands, talks about going feral and escaping capture. And there's some real power there. And the other thing that you just mentioned that just like gives me like all of the spirit shivers in the best way possible is I hear you talking about communal care, radical communal care of being an ERG leader. And I ran LGBT staff and allies special emphasis program for many, many years at Veterans Affairs and also worked in the Hispanic Special Emphasis Committee. And so I know that the kind of people who end up leading ERGs are a very special group of folk. And there's a way in which what you just described about thinking about self-defense courses and, or, no cost access to tampons at work, how radical communal showing up for one another is, regardless of whether or not I am experiencing domestic violence or whether or not I am currently menstruating, I know that is an issue that is important to our community, and I'm going to use whatever access to power I have right now to ensure that we are creating a community, a system that starts with the people who are most at risk, most vulnerable. So we start our programming there, and then everyone else gets swept up in a good way.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. What if the baseline in every workplace or out in the world was for those who were blind or were in a wheelchair, and those are just some of the physical ones, the ones you can't see, neurodivergence. What if again, baseline? What if that were the baseline?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love the way that Urvashi Vaid has written about this in her book, Virtual Equality, talking about the widest net theory and how everyone gets swept up. It's benefit to everyone. It lifts all the boats at the same time. And the most clear example to me of that are the sideway cutouts. So thankfully, because of disability rights advocates, we have cutouts at the end of our corners that enable a wheelchair to get to be out in community. Who else benefits? Parents who are pushing strollers. There are so many different ways that other people will have more access to society and engage if we do start at that place where there is the greatest challenge to accessibility in the first place.
You mentioned the corners. I think about that, the cutouts, and also the bumps on the actual corner for people who can tell that, oh, I'm approaching an intersection.
Exactly.
What are those called?
Yeah, this is where my ignorance as a currently able-bodied person is
Same.
limiting my knowledge. I don't know what it's called, but I know what you're describing. It's a really cool thing that we can see, and I think especially right now, to be able to see our connections and how we are all going to benefit by an ethic that says, no, 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 we're not leaving anyone behind, and we're not allowing ourselves to be split off from one another. We are strongest when we are together, and it doesn't matter who has access to the microphone. We all see each other, and we've got each other.
When hearts and souls find each other like this, it's pretty magical, which is my whole vibe and energy and how I move these days. So it's really, really beautiful to be in space with you. Eliana, what's on your heart today?
Yeah, I am at this very moment so deeply grateful, Amy, that you have used your lived experience and access to technology and resources to create the space right now that I know so many women and people who love women will be able to find strength from. So I am right now at this second so grateful to be in community with you. I am working on several things that might be of interest to people, especially right now. So I'm doing a qualitative study on the experiences of women who are pregnant in abusive workplaces, looking at the ways that the babies are harmed by that workplace abuse. And I have interviewed now 19 women. I completed an interview last night, and every single one is so powerful because, by golly, when we have chronic stress, whether it's from a toxic society or a toxic workplace, the stress hormone flooding in utero and the stress hormone flooding in through breast milk, if a woman is able to nurse, because we know that stress actually can interfere even with lactation, babies are impacted physiologically and in terms of their mental health, and those injuries can last a lifetime. So that workplace abuse is not just that bullying, that mobbing, that incivility is not just potentially injuring the woman's physical health and her own mental health, but is actually going to cause intergenerational trauma that society ends up footing the bill for. So that's one thing that I'm holding right now. I don't think that we're talking about this. Another piece that's on my heart is I've started a workplace abuse trauma-informed group coaching practice, and it has been amazing, Amy. Oh my gosh, that when we come together in an explicitly and on purpose anti-racist and LGBTQ affirming way, real healing can happen for us, within us, between us, and that the workplace trauma is a social injury. It happens in a public context oftentimes, even if it's behind a door in a private one-to-one meeting. That is a violence that happens in public. And I've learned this again from Dr. Resma Menakem. We need to heal it in public too.
That's really fascinating. Because one of the first things you and I know about workplace trauma is it feels so isolating. You can't imagine. It feels like at the least of it, at the simple version of it, it feels like you have egg on your face. You're the only one. And
Mhm.
I think it's brilliant that you found a way to bring everybody together because, again, so from an energy coach perspective, my modality is energy. As you heal as an individual, but within that social construct, in that communal care, which is what you were speaking of earlier, that creates that ripple effect out into the collective. And that's really, really beautiful. And I want to really quickly go back if you need additional women to talk about your first research on.
The stigma of workplace abuse keeps us from sharing these things out loud. And this is one of the most traumatizing things that can ever happen to a person. And I have interviewed women
Mhm,
miscarried. I've interviewed women who had stillbirths.
mhm.
And my own baby was injured in a workplace abuse situation. And that's why I'm doing this, because nobody ever asked me when I went into my prenatal appointments, Amy, nobody
No.
asked me, are you being abused at work? I worked at a women's health clinic when I was a master's level student. We served women from a 10-state radius in
Mm.
Illinois because where the laws were at. This is a clinic that was firebombed. This is a clinic that every day when I walked in, I had to cross the lines of people standing outside and protesting. I think about Dr. Vivek, right? Our U.S. Surgeon General, who came out with a report, in 2022, about workplace mental health. And he is in no uncertain terms saying there is a cost to companies when they allow workplace abuse, psychological abuse to happen. Dr. Gabor Mate and his new book, not so new, it's also 2022, The Myth of Normal Illness, Health, and Healing in a Toxic Culture, is sharing study after study after study that's talking about the impact of those stress hormone flooding during in utero and after birth. And so we have the science. The science is very clear.
Yeah.
It is our late stage capitalism that tells us that, oh, what happens at home stays at home. That's private. What happens at work, abuse, that's not abuse. That's just business. This is business as usual. And the intersection point there is exactly what you were just talking about. It is a war zone that's happening in our bodies. And when we are pregnant, we are so incredibly vulnerable, both as a pregnant person as well as with the fetuses. I can't even articulate the grief and the betrayal, social betrayal. It's institutional betrayal.
The work that we both do, while different, similar in terms of like we're helping people return to themselves and heal inward. Do you feel by any degree when the landscape of sociopolitical or otherwise is wobbly, that our work, for me at least, it helps me to understand through the work that I'm doing and the folks that I serve, I'm doing my part. When I was still in corporate and something quote unquote would bad happen, I used to feel worse because I didn't feel like I was on the forefront of anything. Even though I was, to your point, when I was in the workplace and being abused and also the leader of the Women's Employee Resource Group, which I love so much what you said. Yes, the leaders and I, we were a different kind of people in the workplace. With all of the humanity, the loss, the grief, the hurt that you hear about from day to day, how does your work help to reconcile that? Or does it for you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I kind of think about it in a couple of different ways. I am absolutely clear that the reason why I was targeted by workplace abuse and ultimately mobbed out of a job was because of my unwavering commitment to justice and talking about issues of inequity. And the nicest way to say it is inequity. And the most direct way, and I think accurate way to describe it, is abuse of power towards employees, and abuse of power toward taxpayers, and abuse of power toward the larger community who benefited from the work that we were doing. And so this plays out in the research, Workplace Bullying Institute, the research studies that Dr. Gary Namey and colleagues do, nationally represented sample repeatedly of the workforce find that there are characteristics of the people who end up being targeted by bullying and abuse, and having ethics, refusing to engage in nasty politics, and having a high emotional IQ such that we tend to get along well with others. So we tend to not be the narcissists. We tend to not be the abusers in the workplace. And that is an existential threat to the people who end up targeting us for abuse. So I feel like to some extent your question, like it's like both sides. I feel like because I am unwilling to participate in a system that injures people without trying to change that system, that's what brings the abuse on to me. And that is why, for me, spending my life now completely and 100% devoted to the people who are also targeted by this kind of workplace abuse is the greatest honor of my life, because that means I get to work with people like you. And what changed for me, the beginning part of my own recovery around my own workplace abuse, was realizing, oh, this is actually the cool kids club. This is who I want to be surrounded by. Had I been doing any kind of diversity, equity, inclusion work and not been forced out of a job, like at some point, it makes me wonder, like, well, what kind of diversity, equity, inclusion work are you actually doing? Right? This is what happens to us if we're effective. And so it gives my life meaning. It gives my life joy, and I have pride. I have realized that unlike the stigma that so many of us are taught to internalize, I am actually quite proud that I was that much a pain in the neck that they couldn't silence me effectively, so they had to force me out.
I mean, samesies. I mean,
Yeah.
so thank you so much. That's so beautiful. I love the Cool Kids Club because I didn't realize how cool it was. Abuse is not cool.
Right.
That's not what we're saying. I'm not grateful for the abuse I experienced. I am grateful for like my spirit guides, my universal team getting in a huddle and saying, okay, let's show Amy another pathway and give her a permission slip to go and explore that new pathway, which is that healer energy, that warrior energy I have within me. And what's interesting is, to your point, even after I experienced workplace abuse in my 9 to 5, going out and doing this work has also led to abuse more out in the wild. I'll make a post about workplace abuse or trauma or not feeling safe, and I'll get people challenging that out in the wild of saying, can we normalize? Basically, this one person was saying, well, they were asking to normalize workplace abuse. They're like, can we not call it that? I'm like, no, or yeah, I'm absolutely going to call that because it's real and valid. And I actually referenced one of your posts at one point. I was like, you can see in the brain the trauma and a scan after a workplace abuse, and enlightening people of this. You know, this, we get a lot of folks by doing this work showing up saying something along the lines of, well, is it abuse or is it just somebody having a bad day? And I'm like, okay. So, and depending on whether I'm feeling into my healer or my warrior that day, depends on how I respond or if they get a response. You know, I like to lean in, and I'll give you like kind of one shot if you're asking from a place of ignorance, blissful ignorance, or if you're asking to like stir something up, which, you know, I'll give you one response. And then beyond that, you might get a good block.
Yeah, that reminds me that I will never be grateful for what happened to me in that workplace abuse situation. I'll never be grateful for it. And post-traumatic growth, I know some of the indicators for me of my own post-traumatic growth, and this is not necessarily what happens for everyone. I have many privileges that have enabled me to do some of the growth that I've been able to do, but part of it is I am allergic, literally allergic to any kind of gaslighting right now. You come at me with any kind of gaslighting, that's what they're doing when they're saying, let's not call it workplace abuse. Why? Because that makes you feel uncomfortable. Why does that make you feel uncomfortable? You know who doesn't like boundaries? Abusers. Abusers do not like boundaries.
That's what he did say. You're right. It was actually on the gaslighting post. He was like, can we call gaslighting something else? I was like, bro, you're gaslighting a gaslight right now. Had no idea. Or if he did, he didn't, you know.
And so I now have a kind of boundary that is much less permeable than it was before. And this is another thing that's been on my heart and that I wonder if we won't find some benefit to. So back again to the Workplace Bullying Institute statistics, 67.5% of people who responded to a survey on the Workplace Bullying Institute website. So it's a convenient sample. This is not representative. We wouldn't call this beyond what it is, which is that people had gone to this website, so they have got some interest in being there, and then they themselves decided to take the survey. 67.5% of people had pre-existing interpersonal trauma before the workplace abuse. I think that's an important percentage for a couple of reasons. One is I have been wondering the extent to which workplace abusers groom us as targets. And I want to give an activation warning to the audience. I'm not going to talk in detail, but I do want to just acknowledge child abusers groom children too. I think that there is something similar that happens. And I think that part of the way that this happens is at workplace abuse situations, they're testing our boundaries initially to see to what extent can I get away with doing something, and this person is not going to have a conscious awareness of it at the moment. And what I think it looks like, and this is what happened for me, I was making a lot of excuses. Oh, that person is just having a bad day. Oh, it's just their personality. Oh, it's a difference in culture or something else. And what it meant was that I was not fully aware of the absolute risk I faced at that moment. I had no idea that they would destroy my career. That was unheard of prior to that point. And I've worked for many, many years. I had worked with some really amazing supervisors who hire talented people and then delight in them doing their job. I had never been in an environment where it's the pet to threat, right? So Dr. Thomas's work, it never made sense to me that a supervisor would hire somebody because they have really strong skills. And then when that person gets on the job and starts to use their great skills, that the supervisor would feel threatened by that success. It wasn't even a part of my reality. Neither had it been a part of my reality that I could be in a work environment that was so depraved and sick that they would allow somebody to be forced out in that kind of a way. So leading up to that point, I think I was making excuses for people because it was a survival strategy. When we are children, if somebody has responsibility for clothing, feeding, giving us a place to stay is hurting us, the thing we have to do the next morning is pretend like that isn't happening. And for us to say, oh, that person is dangerous, that risks our ability to stay alive. So what happens in children's brains is that we tend to disassociate. And I think that comes up later on in life in the workplace. And I think that the other side, that there's a parallel here, and we know this there's a power and control wheel, a researcher who has looked at the exact same tactics, power and control tactics that are used in domestic violence, map on exactly to the power and control tactics that happen in the workplace. So we're talking about economic exploitation. We're talking about isolating people. We're talking about undermining one's reputation and so on and so forth. So I think that when we talk about domestic violence or interpersonal trauma that happens in a home, it directly correlates to what happens in the workplace as well. And I'm hearing this in the research, the interviews that I'm doing with women as well. I really like Dr. Jennifer Freyd's work around DARVO, the defend, attack, and reverse victim and offender. So institutions tend to, when we report that we're being abused at work, they will hunker down and protect themselves by turning us into the problem. And then that's a way to force us out. Dr. Freyd's work has found that just telling people that DARVO is a thing can help us to protect ourselves. And I really think that future research can help us. If we are the people who have early childhood trauma or interpersonal trauma in our dating years, or if we're married or whatever, as teenagers, as adults, and so on, and we are people who are committed to justice and we're committed to speaking out when injustice happens around us, we need to be extra careful to make sure that we're aware when our brains kind of turn to make it seem like we're safer than we actually are. So ultimately, I think it's actually hopeful. I'm finding some hope in this moment. But I think part of where I do find difficulty and sadness and stress and re-experiencing trauma, frankly, is in our advocacy spaces when we are not dealing directly with racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on. That's going to come up in these spaces. For those of us who were impacted by discrimination in the workplace, the injury is going to be extremely high because we've gone to these advocacy spaces thinking we're going to be understood, thinking that everyone is going to be on the same page, that we don't bully each other. And so when bullying comes up in these advocacy spaces, woo, does it cause some problems?
Yeah, it's a big part of why I stepped away for the rest of the year with that specific work, because it just started to bring my whole vibe down.
Mm.
not our immediate circle of folks that we work with, but like outside of that. So I've pulled back a little bit to reserve and preserve the work for Unlock the Magic, coming from a place like shining my light for others to find the light. I found that more and more it just wasn't serving me. So I want to touch on I'm directly what you're talking about, meaning I grew up in a domestic violence home, and for the first 20 years of my life, my foundation, my root chakra was psychological, emotional, and physical abuse. And so when I went to go enter the workforce, how welcoming was that for me when someone wanted to exert their power and control over me? That felt really safe and comfortable and familiar. So that's what I thrived upon for about 15 years. And then the last 5, I was like, ooh, my soul was stirring and
Mm.
starting to step into this energy of healing and warrior to create the balance we've never seen in this lifetime. Oh, by the way, I also had my entire lineage of women before me showing up in my sacral energy, my womb space. And they had all chosen me to be the one, the cycle breaker, the healer. And so it's, I have like literally thousands of women in my energy space at all times from my entire lineage. And so all of that is true inside me at 42 years old. And I'm like, whoa. So that's why, whew, and they're all coming in right now because they feel me.
Yeah.
Um,
Amy, can I tell you that that was literally healing for me to hear you say that in the way that you did. And my grandmothers are here with me too right now. I think another piece that I'm starting to pick up on after I was mobbed in the workplace, then I was mobbed in another sphere in my life. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps Score, talks about in late stage capitalism, very often when we tell others that we have been abused and bullied, telling other people can actually increase our lack of safety outside of the context where we have been abused. Because in late stage capitalism, people align with, and this is going back to what we were talking about a second ago, with the strong guy, the mean guy, the bully. That's a way of surviving.
yeah.
And so when you talk about women ancestors coming to you right now and saying, you're going to be the one to break the chains, you're going to be the one to break the patterns of damage and injury. And it's incredible. And I needed to hear that because I know that I know that that's what's happening for me too. And last week was Dia de los Muertos. And so in my culture, I'm Mexican, Irish, Czech mostly, but there's Basque in there and other ancestries as well. But in my Mexican culture, we build an altar where we have pictures of our ancestors and we put food there and we put marigolds. And this is an over 3,000 year tradition that literally we are welcoming the spirits of our ancestors into our home. And we get to be with them and we get to tell stories and love on them and they get to love on us. And during these interviews that I've been doing with women about their pregnancies, it's been hard. And I think that's the other side of the question that you were bringing up is like, what is the impact on me to do this kind of work? And how do I show up in a way that is good for other people, but also good for myself too, because we are all human ultimately at this point. And so anyway, long story short, I have left my altar up longer than I would have ordinarily done because I know right now I need to see and feel them even more. So I really felt it when you were saying those things. It was like, oh, they're telling me that too. Like I oftentimes will think about my grandmas sitting on like lawn chairs with someone else's grandmas, and like they might be like sharing some popcorn or something else, but just looking down and look at what they're doing. I feel like your grandmas and my grandmas are like loving us together so much right now.
You're like, look at this. Whoa. And Ileana, that's my favorite part of being out here. And listen, some days it's hard advocacy work. Some days it's hard to do healing and warrior work. And at the same time, it's really awesome when we run across each other because it's like, oh, cool. Of course, we were all here in this time and space to create anew. And I'm going to go to a post that you made recently and then ask you another question as we start to wind down. But at this particular space and time, may you have any permission by any degree, anyone that's listening, to find those that you feel kindred with and feel lit up. Find your squad. It's a really important time to do that. So you posted, are your emotions swinging from panic and overwhelm to numbness and emptiness? This is an absolutely normal experience of trauma, whether from workplace abuse, changing world order, or ecological collapse. Trauma is not what happened to us, but rather what happens within us. This pendulum of extreme emotions is protective, not defective. We cannot immediately change what happens in the world around us, but our vagal nerve allows us to regulate what happens within us. We can literally make our brains release feel-good hormones, grow new neural pathways, and calm our traumatized bodies through our breath and movements to release traumatic retention. So, Eliana, I felt this with everything that I am because I never want to talk in like toxic positivity, and I will always tell women I serve, sit in the shit, like feel it, absolutely feel all of it. Actually turn the volume up. Let's get really loud about it and give such grace, honor, and gratitude toward that part of us that is kind of throwing a penalty flag. Meaning, we get to feel our triggers, and by if any degree, can we see the glimmer that it's for us, that it's for the growth or the healing. Here's my personal philosophy. When something comes into your consciousness, and I'll give you an example. In my lived experience, I have a history of infidelity within personal romantic relationships. That came up in my current relationship recently. Not that he did anything, but the wound came up to heal. It entered my consciousness when it hadn't before with him. And I was like, oh, interesting. Okay, this hurts like hell. And it's for me to sit with and move through in this moment. So that's what struck with me when I read your post about that. If that lands with you at all, whether it's like, it's all for us. And that's really hard to reconcile when it hurts like hell in the moment.
Absolutely. It resonates completely. And it resonates. The first thing that I think about is our intergenerational trauma too,
Yeah.
because so often it might be like, wow, this really hurts. This hurts a lot. Why does this hurt so much right now? If I even just look at my own history, if there's not something that I can immediately identify within my own history, it may very well be my parents or my grandparents or my great grandparents. And we know that what happens to a grandmother, if she is pregnant with a daughter, that daughter's eggs are already forming.
Mhm.
And that's why what happens to that grandmother's life, the amount of stress that she experienced, the amount of support that she has, can impact that grandchild's physiological and emotional, psychological experience on the planet. So when I think about like my work, my completed workplace mobbing, on my father's side of the family, my grandfather, Lupe Ramirez, he came here for the first time from Mexico when he was a young child. And he was preteen and he was a farm worker and he was deported many times. And so when he would go to the fields in the morning before dawn, they didn't know if he'd come home at night because immigration could sweep him up and deport him. And sometimes he would be gone for a whole year before he could come back across. That is mobbing. That is mobbing. That is our society at that point was allowing for this rounding up and forcing out through the weaponization of the institution of the state. And that is what happens when we are mobbed at work. And so the terror that I experienced when I realized that they were mobbing me out of a job, I don't think it was just my terror. I literally think that it was tapping into some very old trauma in my family. And I think that's the other piece that why we have to bring anti-racism explicitly into our work around workplace abuse and bullying. And when we don't, we are really causing injury to people because it does matter. It matters more than just that, yes, we have anti-discrimination laws right now. Hopefully we'll have them in the future. But the reason why we need to have people of color and queer folks and people with disabilities who are in leadership positions in all of these advocacy organizations, it's meaningful beyond just whether or not there's a current law or not outlawing psychological abuse. We've got to be talking about these other things. I think the other side of it, though, if I can, is just to say, I know as a person of color and as a queer identified woman who was raised by a gay father, and there are multiple queer people in my family, both sides of the family, several generations back, I know that the skills we have to develop to survive in a racist, sexist, homophobic society are extremely useful to our ability to defend ourselves and one another, whether it's in a workplace abuse situation or in a situation where the person who is entering the White House is a known abuser. We have this wisdom in our bodies. We have this wisdom in our histories. And this is the time when we get to show up and do it. This is why 94% of Black women voted for Kamala Harris. It's a very explicit kind of survival wisdom that comes from our ancestors, and we've got that. And I think there can be a lack of hope right now, in part because most of us have not been taught these radical histories. But it's okay, we can learn them from one another. And so, like when you were talking about making your own bread and getting off the whole system that's dependent on this toxic system, like you're going to be able to survive. That's literally what you're doing right now. It's so amazing.
I hadn't thought about it on that macro level. Thank you so much for recognizing that in me. And it's something that came into me months and months ago. I, over the summer, had this beautiful bounty of tomatoes and was able to can 40, 50 cans of homemade tomato sauce, hopefully until the next time we're able to plant a small garden. So trying to build some sustainability within my gorgeous, safe space here within my four walls is something that I'm really going to be focusing more and more on. So
I think what's so amazing, like what you just talked about, speaks to me about indigenous wisdom. And all of us have indigenous wisdom.
yes.
Too often in the United States, the way that we think about race is that we think that only Native American people who are indigenous to North America are indigenous, but all of us have indigenous ancestry. And on my Irish Czech side of the family, we all have indigeneity, and there's wisdom in our original peoples. And so reconnecting to that, right? I mean, I go back to like Gaelic society on my Irish Czech side. And if anyone is interested in this, Dr. Lila June is somebody that I really, really recommend for folks. She talks about the wisdom of European ancestry as well as the racial trauma of European ancestry as well. So anyway, but for folks, thank you for asking if people want to connect. I really welcome connection requests on LinkedIn. And the reason for that is because I do a number of no-cost LinkedIn events that have to do with trauma, workplace abuse, and recovery. And when I'm connected with people, I can send them direct invitations to those events. The second piece is I have a website, Hostile Workplace Recovery LLC, and love to connect with folks there. Please do reach out. I really welcome, and I need you, and I think we need each other. We all need each other right now more than ever.
How do we join your new group coaching around workplace trauma abuse?
Thank you. So I just finished the first cohort. I'm doing it in a trauma-informed way. And what that means is that I interview every single person before they get into the group. Because frankly, many of us have stalkers. We have stalkers from former abusive workplaces. So I'm trying to create an extra level to decrease the chances that they're going to do that legwork to get into, and excuse me, that was an ableist term. Let me rephrase that. I'm trying to create a little bit of extra work so that it will deter people who would want to join just for the purposes of harassment. The second reason why I do that is because it's an opportunity for me to explain to people what the trauma-informed practice is like. Because honestly, so many of us were abused in Zoom. And I do these workplace group coaching cohort sessions on Zoom. So the fact that we have to log into something that could send us into a panic attack, an anxiety attack, I want to let people know extra level of like how we can protect ourselves in this environment and what you can expect from me as a facilitator. Also, the difference between group coaching and group therapy. It's important. So I do it on a cohort model. So that way the people who start the group are the same people throughout. So as we're developing rapport and hopefully some trust with one another, we don't have to worry about new people coming in and that group dynamic shifting. So I just completed my first group coaching cohort. It was so amazing what people said about the impact of it. And I'm gearing up to start another one. I have taken a 2-week break right now because I want to make sure that my nervous system is settled in a way so that I can create space for everyone else. Because honestly, so many of us with workplace abuse histories, with interpersonal trauma histories are really hurting extra right now with the election. So people can find out by connecting with me on LinkedIn. There's a waiting list so people can sign up for it. And then when the next group coaching cohort starts, I'll reach out to them. I do have a sliding scale. I want to make it as accessible as possible to people because I know for so many of us, we go to LinkedIn when we're in that workplace abuse situation or right after we've left, whether we were forced out or we had to flee for our own sanity and health. And then we go to LinkedIn. And so for many people, finances might be really tight when they need it the most. So I have a couple of different plans in place so that it can hopefully be as accessible as possible. And I do give out scholarships as well.
Closing remarks as we wrap up.
you are not your trauma. Workplace abuse survivors, you are not your trauma. And it's probably one of the most painful compliments ever. If you have been targeted in the workplace, it probably means that you're bright, that you are emotionally talented and gifted, and that you have ethics. And that's the reason why they have to use such extreme gaslighting to make you doubt yourself and to be isolated and in shame. But we're all here on the other side. So connect with us. You're going to be okay.
Thanks, Eliana.
Thank you so much.